I started studying the things that I have been talking about in, well, really as long back as I can remember. I think that's true. I wrote an essay when I was about 13 on Auschwitz. It wasn't a very good essay, but I was only 13, so it's not that surprising. And I don't know exactly why it was of particular concern to me, except that, of course, it's the sort of thing that should be of concern to everyone. So I said when I was about 13, I wrote an essay on Auschwitz, and I was trying to understand it. I think maybe I tried to understand it in a way that was somewhat different than most people who examine historical events, because I was trying to understand how human beings could do that, knowing full well that I was one of them. And that's the critical thing, because generally when people examine especially something horrifying that's done by humanity, they make the assumption that it's other people doing it, and that's a big mistake in my estimation, because if a lot of human beings have done something terrible, you can be sure that being a human being that you're capable of it. And you know, one of the things that we've been asked repeatedly to do as a consequence of what happened in World War II is to not forget it. But it's always been my contention that you can't remember something you don't understand. And you don't understand what happened in Nazi Germany, or in the Soviet Union for that matter, until you understand that had you been there, the probability that you would have played a role and that it wouldn't have been a positive one is extraordinarily high. When people do think about themselves as actors in situations like that, they have a proclivity to cast themselves in a heroic role, assuming that had they been, say, in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, that they would have taken on the burden of fighting against the Nazis and defending the things that should have been defended. But that's a very foolish presupposition, especially because it's more or less self-evident from the historical perspective that that isn't what people did. And in order for us to come to terms with that, it means that we have to understand how it happened, but more importantly, what role we still play as individuals in acting in such a way that such things are not only likely, but desired. Right, because no one wants to think they're a Nazi, but everybody is one. So, look, it was 95% participation in Germany, and like the only thing that distinguishes, the average person from Hitler is that Hitler was an organizational genius. That's the distinction. It's not the bloody motivation, it's the ability. There's a lot more to people than meets the eye. And the only way I learned that was by looking at people's and my own capacity for evil, because I started to realize that we regard ourselves as narrow little beings in a particular kind of box. And there's real comfort in that, although there's tremendous limitation. You cannot see your way out of that box until you know, well, what I teach my students. I teach them about Nazi Germany, and I try to make them understand that there's an overwhelming probability, if they were in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, that they would have been perpetrators and Nazis. An overwhelming probability. And if they can't accept that, because it's a historical fact, they have absolutely no idea who they are. Now, imagining yourself as a Nazi perpetrator is an unbearably terrifying thing to do. But I don't believe that I don't think that you have any insight whatsoever into your capacity for good until you have some well-developed insight into your capacity for evil. Because people can tell you till they're blue in the face about your capacity for good. It just sounds like wishful thinking. It sounds like the sort of thing that an advertiser might tell you on TV. It's just too good to be true. And I don't think people believe it. But I think that if you tell people that, in the cold, dark corners of their mind, there are motivations that are so terrible that they would traumatize themselves if they were ever revealed, that everyone knows at some level of analysis that that's absolutely true. And so Hitler's informing the audience, and the audience is informing Hitler, and that's why Jung believed that Hitler embodied the shadow of the German people. So that's another reason why you should be careful what you say and why you say it. You know, and why you're looking for attention and all of those things. And actually what's motivating you and actually what's motivating the people who are listening to you. Because God only knows where it might go if you're not careful. Well, actually we do know where it goes if you're not careful. And it's not pretty. That's for sure. And to think that we've learned anything from that, it's like, no, that's not right. We haven't learned a damn thing from it. So, because we don't want to understand it.
Well, you know, one of my credos, by the way, is I like to terrify my students. I'm dead serious about that, man. I think if they're not a little bit afraid of me, there's something absolutely wrong. Like the course I teach called Maps of Meaning, which is based on a book I wrote about 20 years ago. I mean, one of the things I'm trying to convince my students of is that if they would have been in Germany in the 1930s, the probability that they would have been Nazis instead of, you know, oppressed people rescuing heroes is almost 100%.
Right.
And I'll tell you, if you do enough psychological analysis to know that you could have been a guard in the Auschwitz camps, that's not exactly the sort of thing that makes you feel safe. And
Right.
it shouldn't either, because human beings we have an unbelievable capacity for malevolence, and it often disguises itself in, you know, this kind of smug self-righteousness that characterizes these bloody neo-Marxists that have invaded the campuses and that are in the process of invading the rest of the culture as fast as they can possibly manage it. I'm not their friends, not in the least.
Right.
And the idea that we should be making students feel safe on campuses is absolutely absurd. You read someone like Nietzsche or Dostoevsky or Solzhenitsyn, those people will terrify, or Carl Jung for that matter, those people will terrify you right down to the bottom of your soul. That's how you can tell you're being educated.
Yeah, you remind me of...
Absolutely appalling.
Right. If the university is going to make you safe, then it ceased to be a university. So one of the things I try to do in my class, I have this class called Maps of Meaning, which concentrates on atrocity, basically, on Soviet atrocity and Nazi atrocity mostly. And what I try to do in the class is to teach my students that had they been in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, they would have been Nazis. And had they been offered the opportunity to be an Auschwitz camp guard, then maybe they would have leapt at it. And maybe they would have been in the more sadistic proportion of the Auschwitz camp guard population. You think that makes you feel safe? It doesn't make you feel safe to know that Nazis were humans and you happen to be one of them. You know, in my classes, and I tell my students this right at the beginning, I'm trying to get them to understand why they are Nazis. Right, there isn't anything more unsafe than that. One of the things I've always thought about Hitler is that, you know, people, you have to admire Hitler. That's the thing. Because he was an organizational genius. You know, the thing that doesn't stop people from being Hitler, people don't refuse the ambition to become Hitler because they don't have the genocidal motivation. They don't follow that pathway because they don't have the organizational genius. They've got the damn motivation. And I get my students, I said, look, I've told them this for 30 years. Here's something you have to understand. If you were in Nazi Germany, the statistical probability is overwhelming that you would have been a perpetrator. Right? You think you would have rescued Anne Frank. It's like, think again. Those people are very, 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 very rare. They put their lives on the line to do that. They put their families' lives on the line to do that. You think you're one of those people? Really? It's like that. All that means is that you know nothing. You know nothing about yourself. You know nothing about people. You know nothing about politics or economics or history. It's a harsh lesson. People are not that brave. And everybody thinks, this is one of the things I teach in my Maps of Meaning class, you know, it's like, okay, you look at Nazi Germany in the 30s and you think, well, I'd be one of the heroes who rescued the Jews. It's like, statistically, that's very improbable.
Right.
Well, I would say that I spent a lot of time over the last 30 years trying to understand the part of me that could be deeply satisfied as an Auschwitz prison guard. And I would say that that part is something that's worthy of hate. And I think the best way to overcome it
is to recognize it in yourself and to do everything possible to constrain it. And that's what's given me an overwhelming horror, both of the nihilistic void and the catastrophes of totalitarianism. And the reason that I've turned to the degree that I have to the analysis of religious traditions, not losing my scientific perspective in the meantime, is because I've done everything I could to extract out the wisdom necessary to understand how to deal with that bit of unredeemed evil that every bit of us possess.
Being a guard at Auschwitz with a clear conscience is the extreme, the extreme
I was
case
thinking
of
more
that.
of happiness.
What was that?
More of being a guard at Auschwitz with happiness.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Even worse still, right? So.
There was a lesson to learn from the Holocaust. We're always reminded that. Never forget. We've learned our lesson. There's a lesson to be learned. It's like, okay, fair enough, man. What was the lesson? That's the question. What was the lesson? And the lesson is, you're the Nazi. That's the lesson. It's like, really? Really? Oh God, that's a terrible lesson. But I don't see another lesson. It's you. Well, no one wants to learn that. I mean, that's what I've been teaching my students since 1993. It's like, if you were there, that would have been you. You think, well, I'd be Oskar Schindler. I'd be rescuing the Jews. It's like, no, I'm afraid not.
Yeah,
You'd at least not be saying anything.
Right.
And you might also be actively participating. You might also enjoy it. You never know. First of all, Hitler and Stalin were very singular types, and there's a bit of Hitler and Stalin in everyone, so, you know, there's some truth in that. Maybe there's more in the typical Russian leader
A bit of
than
Hitler
normal.
in everyone? Really?
There's more than a bit.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, well, why would have Nazism spread the way it did? You know, people think, well, that's all top down. It's not top down. There's a part of people that are all these people who informed on Kate Birbelsing.
Well, didn't Goebbels?
And so I'll start the introduction now. Okay. This is a course about the causes of social conflict. I'm not interested in social conflict from the perspective of a political scientist or a sociologist. I'm interested in intergroup conflict, but not at the level of group analysis. I'm interested in what role social identity or group identity plays in individual psychology, and why it is that individuals are motivated to participate in acts of social conflict. I am using, for an example here, the Holocaust. I was thinking last week, writing part of the preface to the book that you're going to read, about the Holocaust Museum in Washington. There's a lot of, obviously this is a museum to the Jews primarily who were killed by the Nazis in World War II. And there's a number of museums like this throughout the world, and their central motto is never forget. And this has always been confusing to me, this notion of never forgetting, because I don't think you can remember something that you don't understand. And I don't think we understand why the Holocaust happened in World War II. I think you might regard the Holocaust as an unlearned lesson, and I don't think that you can process information that you don't comprehend. So to say never forget, then the question is, what is it that you're supposed to remember? And is it the fact that 6 million people were killed? Is it the fact of that particular event, or are you supposed to be giving some consideration to Holocaust-like events that have occurred throughout history? Because there are people who think that what happened in World War II was a relatively unique event. It was something unparalleled in history. This is not a position that I adopt. I think actually it's a very common sort of event. It was perhaps it was the event of that sort that has proved most shocking to the European conscience, so to speak. But it hardly strikes me as unique. And people often talk about the Holocaust in terms of the relationship between the Jews and the Germans, or between the Jews and the Nazis, with the Jews obviously playing the part of victims and the Nazis often
are always playing the part of the perpetrators, and of course this is absolutely comprehensible from the historical point of view. But it also strikes me that if what we remember is that the Nazis killed the Jews, that we're already on the road to making a mistake that's similar to the mistake that was made that led to the Holocaust to begin with, which is to identify characteristics that lead to patterns of action of that sort as characteristics of groups, identifiable groups. And it seems to me, I mean, I'm not trying to equate the role of the Jews and the Nazis in producing the Holocaust. That would obviously be absurd. But what I'm trying to say is that the lesson seems to me to be, especially when you consider the propensity for Holocaust-like events is deeply rooted in human nature. The lesson to draw from the events of World War II is that that's what human beings are like, not what the Nazis were like.
Great evils are easily identifiable, at least in retrospect, and are usually the result, at least in interpretation, of the act of another. We build endless memorials to the Holocaust, for example, and swear never to forget. But what is it that we are remembering? What is the lesson we are supposed to have learned? We don't know how the Holocaust came about, don't know what it is that the people involved did or failed to do step by step that made them behave in such an appalling manner, don't know what or who made German society take such a terrible turn. How could Hitler fail to believe that he was correct when everyone around him bowed to his orders? Would it not take character of exceptional magnitude to resist the temptation of absolute power freely offered, democratically granted, even insisted upon? How would it be possible for anyone to remain properly humble under such conditions? Most of us have personal frailties that remain constrained by our social environments. Our neurotic tendencies are checked by the people around us who care for us, who complain and protest when we lose our self-control and take things in our weakness one step too far. If everyone around thinks you are the savior, who is left to point out your defects and keep you conscious of them? This is not an apology for Hitler, merely recognition that he was all too human. And what does that statement mean? Hitler was human. Stalin, too. Idi Amin, too. What does that say about being human? Our tyrannical tendencies and moral decadences generally find their expression limited by our narrow domains of personal power. We cannot doom millions to death at a whim because we do not have the resources to do so. We satisfy ourselves in the absence of such power with riding roughshod over those near to us and congratulate ourselves on our moral virtue. We use aggression and strength to bend dependent others to our will, or, in the absence of strength, use sickness and weakness to harness the force of empathy and deceive our way to dominance underground. Granted the opportunity, how many of us would not be Hitlers, assuming we had the ambition, dedication, and power of organization, which is highly unlikely? Paucity of skill, however, does not constitute moral virtue. Many kings are tyrants or moral decadents because they are people, and many people are tyrants or moral decadents. We cannot say never again as a consequence of the memory of the Holocaust because we do not understand the Holocaust, and it is impossible to remember what has not been understood. We do not understand the Holocaust because we do not comprehend ourselves. Human beings, very much like ourselves, produced the moral catastrophes of the Second World War, and of Stalin's Soviet Union, and of Pol Pot's Cambodia. Never forget means know thyself. Recognize and understand that evil twin, that mortal enemy who is part and parcel of every individual.
I'm trying to get them to understand why they are Nazis. Right, because no one wants to think they're a Nazi, but everybody is one.
You're the Nazi.